Good evening, everyone, and welcome, and thank you very much for choosing to spend your evening, the early part of your evening, with us. You're going to hear a lot about us, and panel, do come out, and let's have take a seat. This is relatively self-indulgent for us, because we love olfaction. We're all connected in some way to the olfactory sense. You'll hear more about the panel very shortly, but we are going to have a conversation, and I'm hoping you will like what you hear, to the point that it might inspire some thoughts of your own that you can ask at the end. So tonight, the title is The Smell of Success, and the clue is in the title. Smell is a really key part of what we're going to talk about. And, you know, this title is based on the observation that everyone is selling experiences at the moment. You know, consumers now expect a multisensorial engagement. But that, in fact, is a challenge in what is becoming an increasingly digital and perhaps disassociated world. You know, how can we integrate the olfactory sense into the future state, whether that be a product or whether that be society in general? Because I would claim that, in fact, sense of smell is starting to become ignored in favour of the other senses. So, panel, what a great subject to discuss. First of all, let me start on the left. Ange Stavrevska, CPL Aromas. Now, Ange, CPL Aromas, just for the audience's sake, this is a perfume oil supplier.
Yes.
And a creative house in perfumery. And what makes it notable is the fact that it is a UK-based, family-owned perfume supplier, which is very unusual for the industry.
Very unusual. We're about 45 years old now, so we're kind of onwards and upwards, and we've got a team of 6 perfumers in the UK. Yeah. And we work with a lot of UK brands. I mean, we've got offices globally as well, but yeah.
So you would supply the perfume oils for the products that many people would know in the room. And you trained recently as a perfumer.
Yes.
Is that correct? And how was that for you?
Hard work. A lot of it is memorising lots and lots and lots of raw materials. So it is like studying for a degree, really, because you have to...
It's very structured, isn't it?
Yes. And then you kind of work out how the ingredients work together and what kind of effects they have when you put them together, how they work in different bases and formulas. So it's very complicated, and it's quite
People have this sort of rather romantic view of perfumer being a great artistic creative, you know, wandering around with smells in the air. But the reality is it's very structured and very rigorous, isn't it?
Sometimes when you get a creative brief in, it's fantastic because you can be really creative. You can sort of lose yourself in an image and marketing, and then kind of come up with some ideas. But a lot of the day-to-day is quite mundane and, you know, technically trying to make fragrances work in different products.
Ange, thank you.
Pleasure.
So, Hannah, over to you. Hannah Roberts, the Prestige Communication Director and Global Head of Trend at Unilever. Now, if I was going to bet on the future, ladies and gentlemen, of the beauty and luxury industry, I would talk to Hannah first. And it sounds fascinating. Now, personally speaking, I live in the present. I have great difficulty in looking into the future. So I have enormous respect for what you do. How and when did you have that moment where you realised you could interpret the future almost, or you had a talent for doing that?
Well, I suppose I was always that child at school that was doing something. Like my father will tell you, when my birthday's in September, and it would get to August, and my father would say, what would you like for your birthday, Hannah? And I would say, well, I want a pair of this really specific colour purple boots, and I really want it to have a black fringe, like a pixie boot, but a little bit taller. And then I would take my dad to every shop going, and then it was never available. So I would never get anything for my birthday. But 4 months later, my dad would come home and say, that thing that you described is here now. So actually it probably started at quite a young age.
So it started at a really early age, clearly. And what about the olfactory part of it? Is that part of the journey in general?
So I think my beginnings are, in a very nutshell-like way, I started, I think like a scientist, but I execute as a creative, which means that 23 years ago, that means that people like me worked in what we used to call NPD divisions, so new product development divisions, which sat between, formulators and marketeers. So we were like chief scientific communication officers.
Right.
We helped the language and the needs and the benefits and the formulation. We helped make that difference. So in that time, I've worked in the beauty and personal care industry all those years, and of course I've come across and created fragrances and all the other things.
And that skill, that design skill, where you have half your mind is very structured and scientific and the other half is artistic, I think there are more people than we realise who share that kind of situation. Society likes to put people into boxes which are structured or creative, but the reality is there's a lot of both that goes on. So yes. So Lizzy Ostrom, and I'm going to call you Odette Toilette as well.
Right, yeah, both, please.
That's okay, isn't it? Would you prefer the second or the first?
Well, I'm so rubbish with managing my names. Who says that?
Right, it might have to be Lizzy.
I mean, come on.
I have you here as event curator, author, blogger, purveyor of olfactory adventures, and all because you're a perfume obsessive.
Yeah.
And you know what? It's so interesting because you were not actually an industry professional, yet you've been celebrated and adopted by the industry, all because you love perfume.
Yeah,
and I think that's just fantastic.
Yeah.
Did it all start with because I personally met you with the Scratch and Sniff events in London, which is a great name, deliberately, and they were an amazingly enthusiastic collective of fellow perfume lovers.
Yeah.
And they were amazingly democratic. They were not pretentious. They were free for all.
Yeah.
Is that where it started?
That is where it started, in a basement in the book club in Shoreditch, where people were playing ping pong next to me, trying to do an event about perfume. I think what was important when I started is I loved perfume, and I felt as though the mediums through which you could grapple with this subject that weren't quite doing it for me. And at that time, I thought that events and bringing people together in a sociable setting was the missing piece in getting people to appreciate their sense of smell.
Absolutely.
And in my work since then, it's broadened out from events, but I think that was, in 2010, that was a sort of moment where I felt, right, we've got to get everyone in a room. And that's where this is going to start.
Well, you do have a refreshingly democratic outlook, and I like that. The industry needs that. And lastly, we come to Palvinder Mann. Now, Palvinder, your title on the screen here, and I must apologise, is Product Manager at Estee Lauder. And in fact, before that, I know you were at L'Oreal. But for the audience to say again, what is a product manager? What do you do?
So in a nutshell, that means that I handle the marketing for the brand for which I am in employ. So I previously was at L'Oreal working for Yves Saint Laurent. I'm currently an employee of Estee Lauder companies working on Estee Lauder brand. So basically it means I manage the product portfolio in that sense.
So you're doing strategy and creative?
Media, and liaising with the New York office on our sort of strategy and creative going forward.
It sounds very glamorous.
It does sound glamorous. But in practice, it's really not. I think it's a delicate balance of glamour and practicality, shall we say. It's kind of like that.
That is often the reality, isn't it? Well, do you know what? You would have a coffee with any one of these people on the panel. They are all fascinating in their own right. And we're going to have a conversation. And it starts here because we actually... The last line of the title was, how can we integrate the olfactory sense into future technology? And I've got one for you here. This is how we're going to start. So who has not come here tonight with one of these devices? Not an iPhone, but I mean a mobile device of some description. Has anybody not come? We have one person. Was that deliberate, or did you forget it? It is extraordinary, isn't it, how much these have become almost a constant companion in our lives. And something that occurred to me relatively recently was the fact that, well, a colleague was taking a picture of a pizza, and it was great. We were like, okay, that's good. And showing it to us all, going, look, got all that, filter on it. And, of course, what's the one thing that's missing from that experience? It's smell and taste. Smell and taste are missing from the digital experience. And that made me think a bit further, because it made me realize that, in fact, your profile, who you are, the person you portray to the world, is alive and well on this device, but there is absolutely no reference to the smells in your life in different ways. And I felt that that was a real problem as we look forward, because as society gets more entrenched, as this relentless technology continues, the olfactory sense almost gets left behind. And by the way, I brought an old friend with me, because 20 years ago, it wasn't the case. Here's my Nokia 3210. Oh, yes, it still works. I was going to switch it on. It has a little green dashboard. In fact, my colleague saw this on the desk today and said, "What is that thing? It keeps ringing?" And really, this was all we had to communicate. It didn't do nearly anything that we had there, but we should have realized at the time smell wasn't on that either. And that was going to change. So, guys, what do you think about this? What do we think about the fact that technology is marching on relentlessly, and smell is perhaps becoming less relevant to a whole generation of people who are growing up without it in their lives? Any thoughts?
Personally, I think it's really sad. I've spent my whole life has been mapped out by smells. I am not necessarily a perfume geek, but I'm definitely a smell geek. So kind of growing up, smells of garden centres, obviously that petrichor smell when it's been raining on a hot day, everybody recognises that one. The smell of the back of the old TV set. I have all of these fragrances locked in my head, and it's kind of part of who I am. And to actually kind of think about moving forward and having that kind of disappear and become less important.
But those smells will still be there, but
yeah.
you won't give them as much, you won't attribute as much of a mental space to them.
Weird little story. We used to have a plastic Christmas tree at home with all the gaudy decorations. This was kind of like back in the 70s and 80s. And they had a specific smell. And then about probably 5 years ago, I bought a hairbrush from a high street chemist that had a plastic carton. And my God, it smelled of my Christmas tree and decorations from home.
Yes.
And it was just, and that feeling when you have that immediate effect from fragrance. And I kept that box for weeks because it just took me back to being a kid at Christmas. It was amazing.
Yes. And that feeling was really emotional.
Yeah.
And connected, and you felt good.
And so even though I'd pretty much forgotten about the fragrance, it was immediately there. And I think that's why fragrance is so powerful. Maybe not fragrance, but smell. I think they can be seen in
so the Christmas music wouldn't have had the same effect as the smell.
Well, you hear Slade every year, don't you? It just loses its effect of charm after a while.
There comes a point.
I think I disagree with Ange a little bit. It's controversial. Oh. Get out. I think that people do appreciate smell, and I think that young people, new generations appreciate it. I think that the difficulty is for brands, whatever you want to call the companies that are purveying fragrance in all its forms, to interpret that the sort of changing nature of how we want to experience smell and to sort of sell it back to us. So, for example, there is so much nostalgia, as Ange has said, for sort of atmospheric sense of kind of places, quite weird and particular smells. But the question is, how would you make that commercial? And if you're packaging up sort of idiosyncrasies in scent form, what does that look like? Can that ever be a global product? Do you end up with sort of generic libraries of sort of, okay, the smell of your Christmas tree, but it's never quite right for you? And that feels like where we are at the moment. So I feel like there's a will and a desire, but it's not quite getting to that next stage yet.
So I think I'm going to come back to your first analogy with the phone. So from a futurology perspective, I spend quite a lot of time looking at behaviour. So the one thing about phones is if you get to New Year's Eve every year, instead of watching the fireworks, people hold their phone up and watch the fireworks through the lens of a phone. So I've always found that really strange, but what is a phone, aside from a vehicle to text people, because God forbid you should call anyone? The phone has become your hard drive, it's become your memory. And which is why we have, ideas like digital dyslexia, because people are stopping remembering things, because they don't have to remember. So, everyone who's sort of over 40 will tell you what their parents' telephone number, their best friend's telephone number was, their first boyfriend's telephone number, and you can regurgitate it brilliantly. But contemporarily, ask someone who's, someone you've known for 3 years or 5 years what their actual phone number, the digits are, and nobody knows. So there's this lack of training your memory anymore. So for me, fragrance is kind of interesting, because fragrance is the one sense that, rather like a Doctor Who TARDIS, can take you back in time. And that's where I think there's this really interesting conversation about, it's for you, it was, to quote a song, A Fake Plastic Tree, but for me, when I smell Yves Saint Laurent Paris, I'm not only thinking about my grandmother, I'm thinking about the last time I saw her sitting on the end of her bed and her applying a Max Factor Cream Puff foundation. So fragrance has that ability to pick you up and transport you to a period of time, which is an incredibly emotional place.
Yeah.
And it's actually this emotional place that fragrance takes us to, that actually it's the brands, the language, that lets us down almost, because it doesn't allow for that.
It's perhaps unemotional.
Yeah.
What do you think, Palvinder? Unemotional? Is it?
I think super emotional. I think to your point about the generational sort of the risk of the generation now being disinterested by perfume is, to an extent, I disagree with it in the sense that we are as humans bound to this relationship with fragrance. I think, I was recently reading up on this, super interesting, that your perception of scent, you process that in a part of your brain called the hippocampus. Very proud that I can remember that.
Sorry. It is. The limbic system.
The limbic system.
Yeah, there we go.
And it's the same part of the brain where you process memory and you process emotion. And so when you smell something, if it's Yves Saint Laurent Paris or it's something else, it has that power to tap into the exact memory. So, for example, when you're seeing rose written down, it doesn't necessarily trigger anything, because audio and visual perception is not processed in that part of the brain. It's a separate part of the brain.
Exactly.
So you can hear something or see something and it won't evoke anything. But if you smell it, suddenly you're transported to whatever that sort of scent links you back to. So I think that's no less potent for the younger generation.
Yes.
I remember I was at university many moons ago, and I pride myself on being quite a stoic individual, but I had a letter from my mum. I thought it was quite cute to send me a letter. So I got the letter, I recognised her handwriting, I thought, how lovely, Mum has sent me a letter. I opened it, and she had scented it with the perfume that she used to wear when I was young, so it was Giorgio Beverly Hills.
Oh, yes. My mum as well.
She was
They're all wearing it.
I think it's known for being doused, but she used to wear it spray and no more. So anyone else sort of like being held by her, would I smell it? So suddenly here I am.
Yeah.
It was my first term at university, and suddenly the weight of being away from the family and away from my mum was sort of put on me through this fragrance.
Yes.
And now I am bawling, a 21-year-old male at university.
I thought you were going to say you felt comforted and liberated, but in fact you were just...
I think it was the removal from her sort of metaphorical embrace was suddenly sort of more felt than it was before I'd smelled
Gosh, it's so interesting. I think we all agree that smell has this very powerful role to play, and of course it's missing. I had a very interesting coffee with a friend of mine who works at Microsoft Research, and this must have been perhaps 10 years ago now. And he was saying, we're really thinking hard about digital heirlooms and the fact that they don't have the emotional value of an old shoebox full of photographs, which you flick through and you smell the old photos and you feel it. What are you going to do? Give someone a hard drive? There you go. That's your history, that is. Yeah. And it doesn't have the same link, but it does concern me that, from what I understand, and you might tell me differently, I think we are decades away from being able to digitize smell, mainly because it's a perception in any case. It's not direct, it's analog. So we are decades away from being able to do anything in the shape of, let's say we've converted everything that's been written down in human history to ones and noughts, but with smell, decades away from doing that. Is that correct? Have you heard that?
I mean, you can look at it in a different way. I mean, obviously, when we look at the digital world, we're kind of looking at what it can do for us.
Yes.
And kind of, downloading information that's coming towards us. But how about looking at it as a kind of library or repository? Technology is out there where you can sample fragrance on quite a small device that's kind of anywhere in the atmosphere. Maybe you can have a device that will basically keep a library of all these moments in time through fragrance. and hopefully in the future, a bit like cryogenics, you kind of freeze yourself hoping that you'll be able to defrost later on. But maybe you collect them and then,
Well, part of my job is being a serious geek. And a part of being a serious geek is looking at people's patents that they file. So I thought it was really interesting that Apple filed a patent for an odour encapsulator that would sit around your phone.
Okay.
So if you take sort of haptic technology to the next level, it would be essentially me sending you a fragrance via a text message or a sent message. I was going to say a sext, but that doesn't work, does it? A text that smells. A smext, I don't know. And it would be, and whilst you're reading my text message, technically the computation would tell your odour provider to then scent my words or my text message with strawberry or whatever I wish.
Lovely idea, but it's probably simple odours, right? I mean, it's not as complex as we would experience on a daily basis.
Right, because the mechanism would have to be such that it would have to have such an ability to commutate so many different flavours and fragrances within it.
Yes.
So the mechanicals. So they filed this patent, but I don't expect to see it for a good 3 to 5 years.
No, and I think part of the problem is that complex smells in nature are made up of hundreds of molecules, hundreds of components that we very cleverly smell and go, oh, that's a rose, that is. You've done an amazing computational piece of work through perception and learning, clearly.
I think that
I was going to say, realistically, in terms of perfumery, fragrance houses, there are upwards of like 3,000 different raw materials that they use to combine to create fragrances. So, essentially that gadget would need 3,000 different raw materials to then put into its formulation to create the fragrance. So that's where a lot of the complexity comes from. Sorry, Lizzy.
I was going to say that, yes, it would be exciting if you can digitally create a scent, but we've got one of the frustrations is you've got all the scents you want to experience around you in the real world, whether they're near at home or when you go on holiday. So I think that as exciting a technology would be more of a sort of sealant or preservative for smells. So you're basically locking it in. And I was thinking about this in relation to some new fragrances that have got musk molecules in them that have made colognes that last longer to be possible, because that was always a problem, that they evaporate too quickly. And one of the problems is we discover a scent and it's fleeting, whether it's sort of someone who you loved who's died, the scent on their jumper, or you're on holiday and you smell something amazing, and you can take it home with you, but then it will deteriorate. And I think it's the preservation of smell that has real potential.
Yes.
Then that's kind of interesting. That means that the future is, or from a marketeer's perspective, the future is a moment, marketing a moment in time versus a tuberose with a bit of vanilla and a touch of musk. It's marketing a moment.
That's a very nice concept. I wonder whether, though, the viewers of these moments will have different priorities, whether 20 years ago we viewed odour as a significant part of our life because it was very much the social interaction. It was a very physical thing. It wasn't talking to other people on Snapchat. It was about being there, the tribe, the collective, the smell. And I wonder whether, okay, you've got this moment, but then does anybody really care? Will it become even more frivolous because it's just not got as much, as much strength as it used to have, as much power?
I think people are actually closer to perfume than they used to be, in the sense that when you think back to previous decades, say you're in the 20s or the 80s, perfume houses were able to introduce scents that had mass appeal, but they were able to control them. And I mean to say that, for example, you think of the 80s and all of this proliferation of oriental scents, like you had YSL Opium, for example. So you had a perfume house that is able to introduce a note almost, or an olfactive category to an audience who had not experienced it, thereby evoking exoticism or a particular feeling or a particular strength of fragrance. And the public were almost at the brand's mercy. I mean, they hadn't experienced it before. It was something new to them.
Yes.
When Chanel No. 5 launched in the 20s, they introduced aldehydes because it was all about the Industrial Revolution. So it was a synthetic note. So there was this sort of synergy with what's going on in socioculturally, but also the innovation that the perfume house can introduce to a mass audience. Now, I think all of these sort of mass appeal scents are out there, so it's very hard for brands to innovate further beyond that. So I think now the power has actually shifted to the consumer's hands, and they're able to say, I want a fragrance that smells like this. They wouldn't simply go to Chanel and buy Chanel No. 5 because that's the fragrance to buy. They are now coming to us and saying, I want a fragrance that smells like, oud or vanilla. They're so much more in the know.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think that the new generation of fragrance consumers is actually a lot more savvy about what they want, and brands are now looking to not pander, but sort of cater to them. So you have like Chanel reinventing Chanel No. 5 with Chanel No. 5 Low. You have Opium bringing out Black Opium to kind of translate the story of Opium, but to a customer who wants a sweet fragrance, because that's the current trend right now, is sweet fragrances.
So there's a proliferation of ideas almost, which is being pulled by the market.
I think so, but I think it's a lot more consumer-led than it used to be.
Which is no bad thing.
No.
It's interesting because I read a piece this weekend in the paper about how people are routinely scenting their homes in order to make them more saleable. And apparently it is working. And I'm not just talking the smell of coffee and the smell of baking bread, which is a bit passé. It's, this room has a feeling about it. Let's put a cedarwood incense note in here. So they're literally changing the perspective of the potential buyers via smell. And, I wonder whether there were any other product areas that any of you are aware of where traditionally there has not been an olfactive element to it, but they are now integrating that in. So moving away from the phone, but thinking about, is there anything out there that you've seen where you've been quite surprised and thought, oh, they're doing it. They're pulling a smell element in, or a flavour, a taste element. Anything you've seen?
So this is difficult, but biologically, we're finding out a lot more about our olfactory receptors too. So, forgive me to the audience, sperm smells. Scientists believe that sperm, in fact, navigates its way to the egg via its olfactory receptors.
Yeah.
And this, when scientists realised there were olfactory receptors outside of the nasal cavity, that really changed an awful lot. And now we're finding things that the skin has olfactory receptors.
Even the soles of the feet, apparently.
That can help the healing process. So olfactory receptors, smelling, aromas are coming into a whole different dimension, and a whole new world is opening up because of this sense that we are only just still learning about. So it's a very preliminary science. It's a very basic understanding we have about smell right now, which is actually gorgeously naive of us.
It is. It's extraordinary. It must be extraordinary for you guys because we know a lot of this, but the sense of smell is amazingly unknown and unexplored. We still don't really understand how the human nose reads the molecules, do we? Which is why we can't make a prototype nose of any sophistication, and why we can't measure smell. And there is no language of odour either, because you can't dimensionalise it. You talk about smells by talking about something else. But this idea of receptors all over the body is fascinating. I heard they were on the soles of the feet as well, which is great. So, Ange, maybe perfumery via foot control. Is that foot fetishists unite?
Well, I have heard as well about fragrance being taken internally. So swallowing a pill.
Yeah.
I mean, if you
Would you
obviously when you eat sort of hot spicy food, it comes out the skin when you sweat. Rose, if you have lots of rose oil, you can smell a little bit rosy. So that's quite an interesting idea.
Do you need to eat a lot of rose?
Probably, yes. But
so it's a lifestyle choice.
I mean, personally, I'd still rather apply it to my skin than actually eat it. But that's another kind of area that's being looked at.
Are we seeing other product forms? Are there not just a wet ethanol spray? I mean, solid perfumes come and go, for example. People are using body lotions now, a bit like they used to use perfumes. As we know. So people are trying to find other deos, of course, have taken the market by storm. So people are looking and searching for different methods, candles everywhere.
I mean, there's obviously this the sort of ambient marketing as well that is kind of a bit of a buzz at the moment, where people are using fragrance to make environments smell nicer, so people will linger longer and hopefully spend more money in their stores.
Because I just wonder whether it's going to dilute smell even further and make it even more frivolous. I mean, if we are scenting our public spaces and we're scenting our homes and we're scenting ourselves, does there not come a point where it's just simply too much and you just don't care anymore, and all that noise you just cancel it out?
So I think it's going to work in that way, but with a really interesting result, which is that people, and we see this with the popping up of brands that talk to this, but people want to have their own fragrance that's just theirs. So in the world where H&M now has a smell and Zara has a smell, and those people who popped up in France or in Paris for the last 10 years, Zadig and Voltaire has always had a smell. But it's really interesting that actually what we're seeing is people really want to come back to that super old-fashioned idea of a signature fragrance, something that's just mine, something that's just for me. And some people will go and have those moments and not be overcome and overawed by standing in an actual perfumery and trying to find something that they like versus something that perhaps suits them. Some people are just going with, maybe I should just wear what my grandmother wore. Yeah. Which I think is a really beautiful...
Well, it's evocative and it's personal.
But it's another way of choosing fragrance, and I think I think that's a very interesting area, is the ritual, the behavioural trait of how today, in this digital world, how do you choose a fragrance when you don't want to smell like everyone else?
No, and why?
Yeah.
Because you're pushing a bit deeper there as to why would you bother with a smell. One of my favourite subjects, which I love, is the concept of the smoking ban, okay? And I know it's slightly contentious, but before 2007, every public space, and particularly if you were heavy socialising, smelt of cigarette smoke, pretty much. I mean, it was extraordinary. If you were to, this space would be filled with smoke. All the lights would have an amazing haze effect, and it would smell. And I'm trying to think of another point in recent history where there was such a massive olfactory tipping point. And actually, I couldn't think of one, because before 2007, every other smell was masked. And in fact, I associate the smell of cigarettes with having a good time. And I just wonder now, no, seriously. And I know they're bad for you, so kids don't smoke. But the idea that, what are the smells you associate with the pleasurable times of your life? What are they now is a great question, because suddenly there is not one shared single odour that fills a space where everyone is doing that thing collectively. There's a multitude of choices, and this is my fear of dilution, where you go to a very personal place, but then you have to kind of explain that to others. So yeah, actually my grandmother wore that.
But that's this wonderful contemporary notion of storytelling.
Yes.
And everybody wants to tell a story. And again, that's a very social, cultural thing of the present, which is I am in a box that is untickable, and I have my own individuality that I can and you can respect. And my fragrance is representative maybe of today, maybe of this afternoon, maybe of my grandmother, my partner. It can represent so many things to so many people. But we're actually missing the language to enable people to talk about it more freely, actually.
Well, thank you, Hannah, because that's a very precious... You've made it precious again. You effectively said we could become storytellers in the future. What do you guys think? Does this float?
I would agree. I mean, in terms of, from a marketing standpoint, I have access to, obviously, the UK sales market data, and the most successful brand in terms of unit sales is actually Jo Malone. And you can think of Jo Malone in terms of their distribution. It's actually very narrow versus a lot of other brands like your Chanel's and Dior's. They only have their standalone boutiques. And what Jo Malone do very well is focus on layering, fragrance combining, they call it. So you can essentially choose 2 or 3 different fragrances. You have matching body creams and lotions, and you can create your fragrance signature. So I think what they do so well is the storytelling piece, and what they do so well is market to people the opportunity to create something that's only yours.
They do it very well.
So I think brands can stand to leverage this thirst for an individual scent signature by focusing on ways in which they can translate their product portfolio to a customer for a unique proposition. So I think there's definitely a future in it.
I've got a couple of thoughts on this. So first, from Jo Malone, I think another reason they're successful is that they are very descriptive of what the smell is. And I was thinking about your points on technology earlier and how you anticipate what a product might smell like if you're discovering it online and browsing. And there's a little fragrance brand called Pinrose in the States. I don't know if any of you have come across it. And I think they've got 40,000 followers on Instagram, but they do a kind of online questionnaire to get your scent and all of this sort of what do you want. And they, along with a lot of other people, are doing what seems to be sort of happening in the industry now, which is that you're not getting innovation in smell so much as innovation in merchandising and how you package up your range.
Right.
But what technology offers us, what our mobile devices offer us is colour. And what they do really well is they have the colour wheel and they are attaching, red, blue, green, blah, blah, as we've always kind of done in the industry, but they're doing it in a fresh way. So, if you see this blaze of blue and it's sort of oceany colours and very beautifully curated Pinterest boards that they do, I think I know what this blue will smell like. So actually what I think sells at the moment is legibility in your fragrance, where you think, I'm getting all this stimuli through my other senses, and I want the smell to carry through, which actually is about things being quite generic, not necessarily in Jo Malone's case, but you say English oak and red currant, you instantly have an idea what that is.
Yes.
And I think if we're going back to this question of multisensory environments, I mean, there's now immersive workouts and sweat and sweat and sound, and then chroma yoga. Yeah. I haven't been to has anyone been to chroma yoga? I knew you will have been, Sarah.
Conversation later.
Yeah.
Conversation later.
Where you're bathed in light, so you have your red yoga or your blue yoga, and then there are scents that correspond with that. And so, in a way, maybe what scent needs to be for the next few years is not really personal all the time, but actually perhaps predictable, but where it can easily hook in with the other senses and we can build that cross-modal connection.
I think shopping for fragrance for the general population is very tricky. I mean, in store it's split by brand as opposed to olfactively. There are no cues, as you say, by colour or anything. So I do think people need help to find the fragrances that they love before kind of...
Yeah. But just to let you know, we're going to have to wrap up very soon, okay? Because these guys need to ask some questions.
Fair enough.
So what I wanted to ask was, building on that point, we know that fragrances are... A great fragrance is something that you live with, and it's something that gives you confidence. And we know that it has a benefit, particularly to your mood, but we can't prove that clinically. We can't say that fragrance is going to uplift your mood and make you feel happy. Do you think, though, we should be exploring that avenue more and looking for health benefits of smells and measuring them, making them measurable health benefits? What do you think? Or should we leave that to the pharma companies and the perfume world will stay artistic and beautiful and just leave it at that? What do we think? I
do know of other fragrance oil house that have developed a range for helping sleep. And it has been developed with, scientists, research
that has
teams.
Been talked about lately.
So I do think there are benefits that we obviously don't know about because, as you mentioned earlier, it's such a massive world that.
Yeah. So
with little research.
I would say again, all I can talk about is the science that I've read, and there is a wonderful gentleman who is doing research on what I'm going to call happy sweat. So what he's found is that people who were perspiring whilst being very happy, you can take. Yes. And when you actually show that to another person, it will make them happy too. So this notion of...
oh, that's... Oh.
No, well, what I like to think of it as contagious happiness. So that is a real possibility in the future. So people are looking at it, and they're looking at it from deodorant, which is a less glamorous way of looking at smell, but equally is important.
Yes.
But contagious happiness as a form of fragrance. What about a fragrance that makes you feel happy versus one that smells of rose?
Exactly.
And also being able to use fragrance in a more considered way as part of a placebo effect. So we know that if people take a drug for a while and then maybe are offered something that is not the drug, their body will still respond physiologically. So we could also use fragrance as a cue to build into placebo effects so that we think that something is happening even if it isn't necessarily. And just so it doesn't matter if the eucalyptus oil does or doesn't produce an effect on the brain in itself, although it will do, but you take it and you use it in conjunction with these other carriers to then...
And Palvinder, what do you think from a
Well, I'd be terrified of losing sales to this new company of aromatherapeutic, scientifically justified fragrances. But I think there is a danger around it because if you're, as we've been saying, scent is so personal and it's so dependent on your personal history and your emotive background and all of this. So if you're claiming a fragrance is going to do X for you, but then you as a person have another association with that fragrance, there is a danger that actually the variable which comes from your personal experience is not going to give the experience that the fragrance house or whoever's claiming it's going to give to you. So you might smell eucalyptus or lavender and just be terrified or transported to a horrible memory. And
it agitates me, but that's personal story. Yeah.
But I think very quickly, going back to what we were talking about earlier about sort of the scent library and collecting your fragrance memories, again, research for Alzheimer's has found that when people are Alzheimer's sufferers smell fragrances from their past or have rooms that have been decorated, it helps them.
So maybe we could treat dementia. Well, look, this is fantastic. We could go on talking now, I think, for hours potentially, because it's one of those subjects, isn't it? I hope you agree. And I actually,
going back where we started with the famous technology, I mean, maybe, we never want smell to be turned into data. Maybe smell is the last bastion of humanity in relentless technology. Don't you think? There's a thought for you. The unlikely hero, the savior of the human spirit, perfume. Yes. What a thought. There you go. So, panel, thank you very much indeed, because that was great. A round of applause. Very great stuff. And we have about 10 minutes for questions. I would love you to ask us some questions. You know that the kind of talent we have here and expertise. So anyone got any questions? And there's a roving microphone. So put your hand up if you've got a question. Anything olfactive. Oh, wow, you're all lit up now. How does that feel? In the spot. There's one at the front here. There we go. Sit, get the microphone.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes. My question, thank you. Very interesting discussion. My question is about selling fragrances.
Selling.
And I think we went from one way of doing it, which we are saying is old-fashioned or the current way, and then we jumped into what do we do next in future with the iPhone and everything like that. I'm just wondering, is there a step in the middle before we jump into the future? Just because what I've seen so far is just what we're seeing in mobile devices is exactly the same way of selling fragrances, but you just see it on your phone. I don't know if I make sense. Do you understand what I mean?
Effectively.
So do you think there is another way to tailor selling fragrances or showing the emotional part of fragrances currently with what we have now, rather than just jumping over to something very complicated?
Any thoughts? Is there a hybrid model that employs a piece of each that's more familiar, shall we say? Yeah.
So actually, Pinrose do a very beautiful version, which is an algorithm-based version, but they don't just ask you, do you like sweet, do you like savoury? They say, which sound do you prefer? And then play you 2 sounds. Which colour do you feel like in the morning? And they show you 2 colours. So I think that's a really
very clever,
interesting and different way of connecting with you as a consumer on how to pick a fragrance in a world so vast of fragrances.
Yeah, so just do something that is familiar to you and then lock that up.
Or something that just engages you.
Yeah. I think as well in stores, there's a lot more education that could be done. So, do people know what vetiver smells like? Okay, maybe some of you do. A lot of people don't. Yeah. But, it's very fashionable. And so actually, if in store people could have an experience more than actually just being sold to, then their education or their knowledge will increase.
Associating a smell with an experience is great. The stores do that all the time, don't they? So
I also think that so far, I think they're coming through, but so far, all of the exciting things we've seen in the new lot of direct-to-consumer brands in fashion and in cosmetics and skincare, maybe apart from with a few exceptions like Pinrose, haven't quite translated over to fragrance yet. And I think there's a room for founders who are really knowledgeable and take an an educative role with their customers and who really understand how to build up that community. I think traditionally it's been quite hard because you have a lot of brand founders in fragrance, especially in niche fragrance, and some of them talk an awful lot of crap, or they pretend they know more than they do, and they're creative directors, but actually there's still a layer between you and them, and that's where I think maybe we need to see a bit more happening.
I think there's a gap in the market for brands, actually, in terms of what brands are doing, in the way that they market their portfolio sense digitally, and being more behavioral in how they do that. Because I think currently what brands do is they say, okay, I'm launching X product, or my focus is X product, X fragrance, and I'm going to target 35 to 55-year-olds. It's going to be a woman who loves yoga, and she loves going with a profile. Yes. But what they don't do is say, okay, let's just target different segments, monitor their behavior online. Are they spending time on Pinterest? Is she someone who appreciates, I don't know, home decor or whatever? And then supply her through digital advertising with the fragrance which matches her. So it's almost marketing from the consumer, and then choosing the product.
Is what you're saying. So you kind of hook in someone's lifestyle. Yeah. And then that's the more natural way to do it.
Rather than starting from your product.
I'm interested, I look at the gin industry with great interest, and obviously as a personal consumer, but I like the idea that they're looking at sort of dressings for gins now, olfactory dressings, and they are teaching people about notes, odour notes. Cheese, seen a bit on cheeses as well. Maybe we're not really representing the food industry, but food and beverage might be, again, a place that we get help for people to understand olfaction more than before. It's coming up.
Yeah. Ice cream. Yeah. Ice cream are brilliant at doing that. Brilliant.
They admit they look at our industry,
and
at the perfume industry, which is quite interesting for inspiration. It's like the blind leading the blind, isn't it? Gosh.
I think they're doing it better than we.
Yeah. Any more questions? Any more inspiration? One over here. Yep.
Hello.
Hello.
I wonder if there's any kind of studies or thinking going on about smart perfumes that maybe change depending on the occasion or time of day, or like your skin type or who's around you.
There's lots happening in home fragrance on that front with devices. There's what's it called?
It's Airwick, is it? Airwick?
No, it's a startup called Pr something. God, sorry. What's it do,
Lizzy, though?
I'll tell you what it does. Yeah. It will. So it's essentially loaded with a load of fragrance oils, or whatever form they come in, and then it will basically play you different scents depending on what time of day it is, when you come in, your mood, whether you're in the room or not. With your phone, it can tell. So I think with home fragrance, there's more of that sort of scent playlist kind of understanding, using your data.
But you've got the technology to actually make the fragrance emanate. Yeah. I think when actually putting a fragrance on skin.
And wearables just feels in general I just don't know who would do.
I'm aware that there was work connected with biometric measures. So biometrics, whether that be skin temperature or skin moisture levels or heart rate. But you see, my heart rate could go up if I'm terrified or if I'm really happy. I could be sweating because I've just run down the road. I could have been for really, human beings are complex creatures. You can't model a fruit fly on a human being. And so when it comes to any of that kind of work, it gets very complex very quickly.
And you'd have to be wearing tech as well, which, when I'm going out to a disco at night, I don't really want a big gadget up my arm.
However, on a very basic level, deodorant is very smart as a functional piece of formulation. It's an incredibly smart, and obviously not always given the credit it deserves to activate at certain humidities and densities of a room. So that's
encapsulated technology.
Yes. I'd love proper fine fragrance deodorant, not just those, you get the sprays in airports often, but they're not antiperspirants, but I'd love a fine fragrance antiperspirant.
I think
that'd be really good.
Part of the issue is how do you measure success with biometrics? And I know that there was, we were looking at an MRI scanning of the brain. And you can see there was very little consistency between different subjects. So someone might say, I love that smell, and you'd see the part of the brain light up that you would expect a certain amount. And then someone else would come and go, yeah, I kind of like that smell, and they would have even more of a reaction in the brain. So what they said didn't correlate to how much activity was in the center of the brain that actually was responding to the odor. So it's really complicated trying to measure this stuff, and that's maybe why we haven't seen more advances in smart fragrances.
I think a lot of it comes down to knowledge again. If people don't know what they're smelling, there is confusion, and they don't know what to think, really.
By association.
So,
Do we have time for one last question before we wrap up? Is that okay? Yeah, right at the back, yes. 2, great, yes. On the back wall, go for it. Microphone coming.
Hello. I wonder if you could say something about whether perfumes are culturally specific.
Oh, well, we could talk all night about that, couldn't we? Perfumes culturally specific.
yes.
I think from a marketing standpoint, like, we definitely market towards specific cultures, especially for some brands. So it seems that every prestige brand is also trickling down to masstige, and mainstream brands have a kind of Middle Eastern portfolio. And because the UK over-indexes in the Middle Eastern traveller, especially in London and in sort of some of the regional cities. So every brand will have an oud in its range. I mean, you had Tom Ford introducing the first Western oud a decade ago. But
and oud, to be clear again for the audience who might not know, is one of those smells that's just symbolic of the Middle East, really, isn't it? It's a woody, animalic, dark, deep smell.
Indeed.
Yes.
And now it's come to have such an association that it's just associated with niche or high-end fragrance. So you have links with an oud deodorant, which I find galling. But there you have it, and that's sort of put on TV all the time. So you have like a young generation of, I don't know if you can call them fragrance shoppers, but sort of odor-conscious young men who buy into Link's oud range, which I think is super fascinating, where it's which means that the cultural taste has trickled into our own domestic offering.
But I guess, that's still whether it will actually take off or whether it's here, but it's not huge. Will it become the cultural norm? Who knows? Because, it's not necessarily part of the
In the Middle East, they
norm.
have oud-scented fabric conditioners. I don't think that'll ever
Doesn't
pick
smell
up
fresh.
here, but no.
You would be surprised how much home care are looking at fragrances and fine fragrances to really make a difference in the cabinet under your sink. As to what you want, because people are aware, because now that home fragrances kicked off so hugely, actually how you fragrance your fabrics is incredibly important. And if you look at some of the home care detergents that are out there today, they work within that fine fragrance language. So I actually think
Still not sure oud will.
Well,
Trickle down.
I was actually going to say to the Lynx point, actually, I think we should all be very happy that Lynx use oud. You know why? Because that means that people are being sold into a fragrance mentality even younger. Because like the average age of buying Lynx has got to be sort of 15 years old. So actually, that means that we are educating people much younger in this emotional lexicon of fragrance, which actually is only a good thing for the industry.
To answer that directly, yes, there is a huge amount of data about cultural norms olfactively. We know what the American market likes, we know what the German market likes, we know what China likes. Quite similar to Germany, very interestingly. One place that remains an enigma for me is Japan. If there's a place you want to go and look at olfactively and try and figure it out, the Japanese culture is really interesting. A good smell in Japan is neutral, nothing. Because if I was to wear a strong scent, what are you saying to me? It's very interesting, isn't it? Maybe we should learn from that. But yes, there are cultural norms. We can talk about it at length, but we'll say that for another day, I think. Is there time for one more question? Quick one. Anyone got a quick one? Right at the back there. Yes. Microphone heading your way. There he comes. That's it.
Hi. Thank you so much for the panel. It's great. So I have a question about fragrance trends at the moment. So undisputably, there's greater and greater diversity in niche and artisanal perfumery. And with that comes more complicated, more varied and richer meanings and marketing for fragrance. But at the same time, this is coinciding with a big zeitgeist in commercial and mass perfumery of simpler fragrance architecture and sweet fragrances, again, which many consider to be simpler forms. So why do you think those two things are happening at the same time?
Congratulations on the use of the word zeitgeist, by the way. Love that word. I think there is a smorgasbord of choice at the moment.
A virtual plethora, I'd say.
Myriad.
So
The middle of things is falling out in all sorts of industries, not just fragrance. So I think this is a bigger story. This isn't just about perfume, it's about what's happened in drink. If you think about, again, going back to gin, it's either super tiny, bizarre stuff, or it's really big, prestigious players, fashion as well. So it's a big economic, behavioural shift?
Yeah, for me, it's a sociological question. It's about identity, and at the moment, people are reframing how they feel about their own identity and everybody else's identity, which is why you get some people who want commercial fragrances. And now, which is really interesting, is that from a fragrance perspective, people are starting to go back and look at single note fragrances, which I don't think any of the perfumers ever really thought was going to happen. So I think it's an identity question.
Yeah. I mean, you could argue as well that, the traditional ways of marketing products are obsolete. So the last 100 years of marketing is kind of obsolete now. And we have to find different ways of doing things. So you're probably seeing the market trying all sorts of different avenues to appeal. But even niche, as it was known for a long time, is now niche-stige. Yeah. I mean, it's a whole segment in its own right. Let's make no bones about that.
Yeah.
Well, there we go. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think a round of applause for the panel and great effort.